What's up, everybody? Hello, Stat Chasers. Welcome to, hello, Ship Chasers. This is Stat Chasing Week 5. I am your host, Sam Hoppen. Been doing this every week. If you have not watched the show before, this is where I'll be going through some of the key stats, buy lows, waivers that I think are important to help lay a foundation for understanding what happened this past week, what's happened the past couple of weeks, and hopefully give you some insights to get you ready for the upcoming week. Before I get into all the details, want to talk through the stats that I will be using on the show today. From PFF, have a number of stats using routes data. So any stat that I use, a reference routes in comes from PFF. I also use their expected fantasy points model, which is a model that weights opportunity by the line of scrimmage and is something that I use as a measure of a player's usage. Then from the NFL play-by-play data, NFL Faster, I get air yards, which is the distance the ball traveled in the air before it got to the receiver, weighted opportunity rating, or Whopper, which is a stat created by Josh Hermsmeyer, which weights air yards share and market share. Also have receiver air conversion ratio, which is receiving yards divided by air yards and is a measure of a receiver's ability to convert air yards into actual yards. On the flip side, I have Pacer, which is passing air conversion ratio and shows how well quarterbacks or the receivers are converting air yards into actual yards. And that formula is passing yards divided by passing air yards. Have quarterback adjusted yards per attempt, which is yards per attempt, but weights it with interceptions and touchdowns, gives a bonus for touchdowns, a negative takes away for interceptions. Also have pass rate over expectation. So that's with the NFL Faster, essentially for each play, depending on down, distance, time left, puts a weight to whether the play would be an expected pass. And over the course of a game or games, you get an expected pass rate for that team, and then can measure how far over that expectation they're passing the ball. Similarly, have completion percentage over expectations, CPOE, as I'll refer to it as, which shows a completion percentage over expectation for quarterbacks and shows how they're completing their passes. And then have a couple of stats that were popularized by Ben Gretsch, have weighted targets per route run, which weights air yards and routes run with a scalar included, and then high value touches, which are running back specific and are carries inside the 10-yard line and receptions. I'll be going through the stats position by position so I can compare against the other ones, help you again make start, sit, waiver, or trade decisions in your leagues. And then I'll go a little bit more in depth through some team situations that warranted a little bit more attention. A reminder to subscribe to the YouTube channel, become a member for just $5 to get early access to the show. You can be watching it live. As you can see, I think I'm pointing it to right here. You get access to the Discord and a bunch of other benefits. And finally, one quick shout out to @ChangeCollege on Twitter, who graciously has accepted putting the timestamps on the YouTube for each of the positions and the team conversation. So if you want to just skip to one specific conversation, feel free to. But otherwise, let's get rolling here. I'm going to pull up the quarterback chart here, and similar to what I did last week, going to start showing the first chart as a rolling right now 4-week average, so basically the entire season, and then we'll switch to a chart that just shows the past week's data. So for the quarterbacks on this chart have adjusted yards per attempt on the x-axis, touchdown rate on the y-axis, and then the size of their bubble as their rushing yards per game. And the reason I chose these stats are we're looking for efficiency from our quarterbacks. Some quarterbacks can get there from their play volume, but as you'll hear me talk about throughout this episode, a lot of the quarterbacks up on the top right are not necessarily throwing the ball a ton, but they've had some extreme efficiency so far this season. The first guy I'm going to talk about actually doesn't show up on the top right, and that's Daniel Jones. And you can see, however, that his bubble is quite large because he's averaging just under 50 rushing yards per game, which is the third most among quarterbacks behind only Jalen Hurts and Lamar Jackson. This has helped him to a quarterback 6 performance through the first 4 weeks of the season. He's still not the best passer by any means, but he has improved, which is enough at this point to make him a top 10 quarterback right now. He currently has a positive 2.4% CPOE, which is the first time that he's had a positive CPOE in his career. He was at negative 2% for, each of the first 2 seasons of his career. He's also averaging 296 passing yards per game, which is nearly 50 yards more per game than his career high mark in a season. And despite thinking that Joe Judge is a schmuck, New York has a 5% pass rate over expectation, which is above average, and they also have a neutral script pass rate that's in the top third of the league. So it looks like Daniel Jones is a quarterback 1, despite a lot of his primary pass catchers being injured and never having his full set of weapons in a single game this season. He hasn't had all of Saquon, Galladay, Shepard, Evan Ingram all in one game, and now Kadarius Toney looked like he was playing pretty well this past week. So I think it's time to adjust our priors on Daniel Jones, which is something that I and a lot of people struggle with, is adjusting priors, because we get so ingrained throughout the offseason in what we think a player is that it's hard to change that. But he's rushing the ball enough, which lowers both his floor and his ceiling, and can probably be safely played in one quarterback leagues as your starting quarterback going forward. Speaking of people to change priors on, Kirk Cousins is having a decent season. He's sort of always quietly among like the top 15 quarterbacks in fantasy points and never really gets that respect. Always has a couple blowout games, but he was at least having a good season before the game this past week against Cleveland. And he's having success on the back of, you guessed it, his efficiency. He has a solid 5.8% touchdown rate, an 8.1 adjusted yards per attempt. His CPOE is about 0.6%, so he hasn't been exceeding expectations in that sense by any means, but that's actually below the league median. And his receivers are helping him out quite a bit. He's got one of the best wide receiver duos in the game with Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen. He currently has a pacer of 1.11, which is pretty high. That means his receivers are converting receiving yards for 1.1 more air yards than they get. Cousins is currently outside the top 10 in quarterbacks and fantasy points, and I actually don't think his production is what I would consider sustainable, because while he's been efficient, and he will be efficient, and his receivers are going to help him have those big games that I mentioned, Minnesota is and always will be a run-first team. They're negative 5% pass rate over expectation, and having a neutral script pass rate just over 51% are both below average. He's worth some DFS consideration in the right matchup and is a solid bye week replacement that can push, when they face an opponent that's pushing them to pass, but that's about it. I'd rather have Daniel Jones for the rest of the season than Cousins at this point. So now is where I'll make my switch to the week 4 chart. And I thought about taking Taysom Hill out because he's breaking the chart and skewing it a ton, but ended up leaving him in here. I'm going to talk about Trey Lance in a minute, but want to talk about another rookie quarterback who had a solid week 4 as well, and that's Zach Wilson, who had, I think, his best day as a starter. He had 297 passing yards for 2 touchdowns and only 1 interception. He had that beautiful long deep shot to Corey Davis, which was probably his best throw of the year. He's certainly throwing it deep enough because he's averaging 312 air yards per game, but has only been able to convert that to just over 230 passing yards per game. It was also the first time this season that he had a completion percentage over 60% in a single game, but he still had a negative 3.6% CPOE on the game. And finally, he had an 8.6 adjusted yards per attempt, which was the highest mark of his season as well. So looked pretty solid. It's just 1 week and there's still plenty of room for improvement, but Wilson and the Jets play the Falcons in London this week, actually. So Wilson may warrant some DFS consideration, or if you're playing in a 2-quarterback league, I would be comfortable starting him there, but am going to need to see a little bit more going forward to trust him in any 1-quarterback lineup. I teased it at first, but it's time to talk about Mr. Trey Lance. It's a little bit of a weird situation because he entered the game after halftime because Jimmy Garoppolo was dealing with a calf injury. After the game, Garoppolo said that he was hoping he would be out no more than a couple weeks, but then it came out yesterday that Garoppolo just had a bruised calf and that he may actually be able to play in week 5. So I don't really know what's going on. They have their bye in week 6, so I think it would probably make sense for them to start Lance. I mean, it would make sense for them to start Lance anyway, and we hope he is the starter, but want to take a quick peek, at how he played in the 1 half of football that he was the primary guy. He ended up throwing the ball 18 times. He only completed 9 of them for 157 yards, but a lot of those came on a busted coverage play from the Seahawks when Deebo Samuel was wide open and just trotted it into the end zone for a 76-yard touchdown. And Kyle Shanahan said after the game that he looked like a quarterback 2, which is why he was their quarterback 2. He didn't look great as a passer. He had an atrocious negative 12.8% CPOE. But again, the saving grace for him and a big reason, why he's such a valuable fantasy player is he was able to use his legs to his advantage. He ran the ball 7 times for 41 yards, which helped him finish with just over 18 fantasy points in only 1 half of football. So extrapolate that to 2 halves, and that's 36 fantasy points. And on the season, that's a lot of fantasy points. I'm sure he'll score that many points each week. But the point being, I mean, you can see him up on the top right of this chart. Just had an absolutely great half of football from a fantasy perspective. He ended up throwing 2 touchdowns, and say what you will about his passing abilities. But again, Shanahan's scheme is good enough to get the receivers open and utilize the space to get a lot of yards after catch for them. And we don't need him to be a perfect passer to have a high ceiling, as evidenced by this game. Don't have any other notes on quarterback. I think I'll talk about a couple more in the team by team section later on. So with that, moving on to the running back position on this chart here, have rushing expected points on the x-axis, receiving expected points on the y-axis, and then fantasy points over expectation as the size of the bubble. The first backfield that I want to talk about is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers backfield. And Giovanni Bernard is on the mend right now. He's dealing with an MCL injury. It's a little unknown when he will be back, but until he does, Leonard Fournette is being treated like a bell cow back. This is from Dwayne McFarland of PFF, has a great utilization report every week that I'd highly suggest you check out. And this is a tweet from him. These are some snap percentages that he shared from certain situations, but Leonard Fournette took over, and this is from the game Sunday Night Football, this past week, Sunday Night Football. Fournette took over the long down and distance role with a 93% snap share and the 2-minute offense with a 100% snap share with Gio out. This also led to a season-high 79% route per dropback rate, and he had 69% of the rushing attempts in the game and 83% of the short down and distance snaps. So he's averaging, on the season, he's averaging just under 16 total opportunities per game, which is targets plus rush attempts, and has at least 15 opportunities in 3 of 4 games, including 25 on Sunday Night Football. And this is compared to just 6 opportunities per game for our beloved Ronald Jones. And after playing just 36% of snaps in their Week 3 loss to the Rams, Fournette had a season-high 82% snap share against the Patriots. So he's a running back 2 at this point. But moving on to Ronald Jones, even with Bernard out, Jones only saw 17% of the snaps. He hasn't seen a snap share above 20% except in week 2, and I really have no idea why. Fournette is commanding a 63% running back touch share on the season and has a 53% routes run rate, which is pretty solid for a running back. And if Tampa Bay is in a game that's competitive or that they're leading, which I expect most of them to be, then Fournette should be a locked and loaded starter on fantasy teams. I don't see any way that Bruce really goes away from this. The only concern for running backs of the Buccaneers would be Tampa Bay's pass rate over expectation. They currently lead the league with a pass rate over expectation around 10%, but Fournette's been involved enough in the passing game with almost 5 targets per game on top of what I mentioned above. So I wouldn't be concerned if they somehow did fall behind the game. I wonder if the Rams' usage is what we'd expect. But again, who knows when Bernard will be back. Tampa Bay's next 3 opponents are Miami, Philadelphia, and Chicago. So yeah, he'll be featured a lot. He's also one of 2 running backs who's averaging as many opportunities as he is without a single touchdown on the season. So regression probably coming for Leonard Fournette. Things get a little less clear when we shift to the Chiefs backfield, though, where everyone wants Clyde Edwards-Helaire to be a thing, but everyone doesn't include the Chiefs themselves. So there's a bull and a bear case for CEH right now, depending on how you want to look at it. So I'm going to start with the bull, the positive case right now. He's averaging 16 and a half opportunities per game, which is among the top 24 running backs. He has at least 13 opportunities in every game this season, which is solid and consistent usage. He has twice as many red zone snaps as Darrell Williams and has a 62% red zone snap rate on the season. He's got 71% of the total running back touches in the backfield so far this season, and he's running a route on 44% of the team's dropbacks, which isn't great, but it's solid. Now, on the flip side, the bear case, it's a little bit longer, unfortunately. But his snap share has gone down every week since the start of the season, while Darrell Williams' snap share has gone up in every game. It's actually gone down quicker for CEH than it's gone up for Williams. So CEH had a 72% snap share in week 1 and just a 52% snap share in week 4. Williams had one more green zone touch this week than CEH, and green zone is anything inside the opponent's 10-yard line. Williams got in for the score. CEH also did, but CEH only has one more green zone touch than Williams does on the season. And it seems like it's a bit of a coin flip who will be used when they get in close. Williams does have double-digit opportunities in back-to-back games since the costly end-of-game fumble against Baltimore for CH. Clyde Edwards-Helaire's receiving expected points is just under 5 points per game, which isn't great. It's around Jonathan Taylor and Antonio Gibson, who I talked about last week, while Williams is a little less than 1 point per game below CEH in receiving expected points. And finally, CEH's FPO per game is at positive 6 points per game, which means, again, he's probably due for some massive regression in the future. He's had a couple of short area touchdowns the past couple of weeks. And so that's the bull in the bear case. Obviously, the bear case a little bit stronger at this point. You're still going to roll CEH out there every week where you have him, but Williams is pretty clearly the handcuff. He's one of the best handcuffs in fantasy football. Jerick McKinnon's the only other running back to see snaps in this backfield, but he only has one target on the season and is an afterthought that's not really worth rostering. So we'll see where that backfield goes, but it's looking like more of a timeshare than people want to admit. So the next backfield is the Saints running backs, which is really an opportunity for me to talk about Alvin Kamara, who's in a bit of a different role than he's been in the past. And Ty Montgomery and Tony Jones are both playing 33% and 24% of snaps respectively, but they're not taking away from Kamara's snap share, which is at 82% on the season. They've been running some 2 running back sets. Tony Jones has been given just over 4 opportunities per game in the last 3 weeks. He left the game this past week with an injury, but combined, Jones and Montgomery have just 17 touches in the past 3 weeks, while Kamara had 26 touches in just week 4 alone. But digging deeper into Kamara's usage, because I said he was playing a different role, and I'm going to make a lot of comparisons to his career numbers versus his numbers from this year. So far this year, he's getting nearly 20 carries per game, and has had 20 plus carries in 3 out of 4 games this year. And before this year, his career high in rush attempts per game in a season was just under 13 per game. So almost 7 more carries per game this season than he's had in his career. On the flip side, Kamara is averaging just 3.5 targets per game, which is almost 3 targets per game fewer than his career low of 6.2 targets per game on a season. If you hadn't heard, Kamara did not get a target this past week for the first time in his career, which is pretty crazy. But on a total opportunity mark, he's averaging 23 opportunities per game, which would also be a career high, but 85% of them are coming from the carries that he's getting, which is the big shift that I'm talking about. His previous career high of carries as a percent of his total opportunities was 65%, and that's about where he's been at the last 3 seasons since his rookie season. Would obviously prefer a much higher percent of those coming from the passing game where he is so elusive. He gets so many yards after the catch, but he's averaging an abysmal 2.8 receiving expected points per game this season. It's clear that he's struggling in that regard without Drew Brees' presence. And I think if I had Kamara on a team, I would probably look for a sell high opportunity if there was one. Trade him for someone like Najee Harris, who has had the production, has had the usage, but hasn't quite had the production. And obviously, as you can see on the chart here, has a lot more receiving production than any other running back. And the only upside case is that I don't see Kamara's rushing work going away anytime soon because New Orleans' pass rate over expectation is so low. I believe after this week, they might be last, and they seem content just running the shit out of the ball. So if Kamara is going to keep getting that running work because there isn't any other threat, Latavius Murray's gone, but the receiving work was really what helped unlock his upside week to week. For this last backfield, going to switch to the week 4 chart and talk about the 49ers running backs because we now have 2 straight games with Trey Sermon being treated as the feature back with Elijah Mitchell missing the last 2 games. And one of the big concerns for me with Sermon following the week 3 game was that Kyle Juszczyk's usage was that he got 9 opportunities in that game. So he got 9 opportunities. He had, I believe, 4 targets and 5 carries, which is way more than anyone expects or frankly wants to see. And that dipped down to just 4 targets this past week. And it seems like Juszczyk, that is the clear pass catching back because he has 3 targets in all but 1 game this season. No other 49ers running back has more than 6 targets on the season, and that's JaMychal Hasty, who's on the injured reserve with a high ankle sprain. But back to Sermon, he got 19 carries on Sunday to go along with a 51% snap share, which was down from his 59% snap share in week 3. He's also run a route on only 22% of dropbacks the last 2 games, which is terrible, especially for, even for a running back. Sermon's only got 1 green zone touch on the season, and there have been 4 green zone touches given to all running backs in the 49ers backfield on the season. And that's one of the main issues with the 49ers running backs. And it will be with Trey Lance starting for the next couple of weeks, at least if Trey Lance starts the next couple of weeks. And while Lance's rushing threat will likely make these backs more efficient, the opportunities in the backfield, in a backfield that already uses a committee approach when they have guys healthy, will come at a premium, and they won't be the high value opportunities that we want to see. Jacques Patrick, as fun of a speculative ad as he was, can pretty safely be dropped in all leagues. He only played on 6 snaps this past week and got 2 carries, but maybe Jacques Patrick were just the friends we made along the way. Now this could all get thrown. Everything I said about Sermon could get thrown out the window when Elijah Mitchell returns, but it's what we have for now. The 49ers do play the Cardinals this week, and like I said, they then have their bye, so wouldn't be surprised if Mitchell doesn't play until after the bye, but I would certainly still hold on to Mitchell for now because he had 19 opportunities in the first 2 games that he played. A couple other nuggets on some backfields. The Bills backfield is always a hot topic because it's as confusing as any. Moss and Singletary both had exactly 15 opportunities on Sunday, neither with any real game script favor, but this was the 2nd straight game that Moss outsnapped Singletary. They do play the Chiefs on Sunday Night Football, so that may give us a better lens into how these running backs are used in a neutral or even a negative game script, because the Bills have just blown out their last two opponents. The game against the Jets for the Titans was obviously a really weird one because, well, they lost to the Jets, and the Titans were without both Julio Jones and A.J. Brown. But even with that, Henry's routes rate dropped to 33%, which was a season low. And on the flip side of that, Jeremy McNichols ran a season high 56% of dropbacks. And like I've said before, McNichols is most certainly worth an add as the bigger pass catching threat, with 12 targets he had on Sunday, which is the second most targets for a running back this season, behind Najee's 19 in week 3. Speaking of messes, the Dolphins backfield is a complete mess and is a major stay away for me right now. I'm not even buying low on any of these guys, but the breakdown from this past week: Malcolm Brown played 67% of snaps, had 9 touches, and had 27 yards. Ahmed played 10% of snaps, had 5 touches, and had 13 yards. And Gaskin played on 23% of snaps, had 2 carries, and 3 yards. So Gaskin has yet to record a green zone touch this year after having a ton of high-value touches last year. But Brown has 6 green zone touches that have gone for a whopping 9 total yards and 0 touchdowns. And his 1 rushing touchdown this past week came outside of the green zone. The Dolphins just look like not a friendly offense for right now. This is from Jack Miller and his weekly article over on NBC Sports Edge. Saquon Barkley played 89% of snaps in the Giants' Week 4 victory. He ran a route on 36 of 44 dropbacks. That's an 82% route rate, and handled 13 of 14, so 93% of the team's running back carries. And his snap share has increased every week so far, and week 4 was his 3rd straight week playing at least 84% of snaps. So he looks like he's all the way back and is poised to be an overall RB1. To wrap up the running back section, had a question from Nate R in the Discord. Are AJ Dillon and Pollard's volume any more predictable than they were previously? I'm going to talk about Pollard a little bit later with the Cowboys as one of the feature teams. But I mean, AJ Dillon's volume, I think, is a little bit more predictable. It's just predictable in the bad way because he's not getting a lot of volume. He did have 15 touches this past week, so that's good, but a lot of it came when the Packers were ahead in the 4th quarter. So again, I still think that Dillon is just a handcuff for now, and I wouldn't trust him in a lineup, though I would trust Pollard, and I'll talk with him about him a little bit later. But moving on to the wide receivers for this week, I'm going to talk about these wide receivers as groups, highlighting some individual players, but you have weighted targets per route run on the x-axis of this chart, air yards market share on the y-axis, and size of the bubble as fantasy points over expectation, and that's per game. So the first group I'm going to talk about are the Seahawks wide receivers, which is one of the most concentrated passing attacks, which you absolutely love to see. It helps make things projectable, predictable, and reliable. DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett's combined target share is 57%, which is the 2nd highest combined rate for a team's top 2 pass catchers. Metcalf currently has a slight edge over Tyler Lockett in target share, 32% to 25%. And excuse once again Crosby's noise; he's got some shakes again. But Metcalf has the target share edge. He also has an air yards share edge, 46% to 35% 50%. You're going to start both of these guys each week, no matter what. Metcalf is averaging just over 15 receiving expected points per game. Lockett's down at 11, neither of which are particularly great because they're both outside the top 20 receivers. But, if there is one guy whose production I expect to regress, it's probably Lockett because he's averaging almost 7 fantasy points over expectation per game this season. You can see his bubble right on the dotted line here is among one of the biggest. His air yards have also dropped off significantly after recording 108 and 162 air yards in the first 2 weeks. He's recorded games of 13 and 29 air yards. Now, some of this may be due to being a little banged up, but Metcalf has had at least 77 air yards in each game this season and is averaging just over 100 air yards per game. There's certainly a major headache when trying to pick one for DFS, and it seems like I always get it wrong, but the correlation between them is very low. So usually one goes off and the other does next to nothing. But again, you're starting them both in redraft leagues where you have them. If for some reason you have both of them in a redraft league, I would start both of them because it's nearly impossible to predict who's going to have the boom week. But the other guy I want to talk about is Freddie Swain, who's not worth an ad yet, I don't think, but could definitely have some value if one of the two guys get hurt. God forbid that they do. But Swain's running a route on 64% of dropbacks on the season. But it's, again, as you would expect, it's been a little boom bust with him. In weeks 2 and 3, he ran a route on over 80% of dropbacks. But the other 2 weeks, he was below 45%. He's only averaging 3 targets per game and 18 air yards per game. He's just going to have those boom games, I think, when Russ goes crazy and for some reason doesn't target one of Metcalf or Lockett, but someone to certainly keep an eye on as the season progresses. The next set of receivers I'll talk through are the Broncos wide receivers. Unfortunately, they're dropping like flies right now. Jerry Jeudy is still out and is going to be out for a couple more weeks. KJ Hamler tore his ACL, and outside of the receiver room, Teddy Bridgewater is hurt. He's dealing with a concussion, and it looks like we may get Drew Lock for a game while Bridgewater recovers from that. And when Lock went into the game this past week, he targeted Cortland Sutton 5 times and Noah Fant 6 times. But going to look at this receiver room through a season-long lens, because it may only be one game that Lock ends up starting. But Sutton is looking absolutely fantastic. He's in this top right part of the chart where you want to see him. He's averaging 7 targets per game. He's got a solid 0.65 weighted targets per route run. He's running a route on nearly 90% of dropbacks and has a yards per route run of 1.92. He has an ADOT of nearly 18 yards. So he's getting targeted way downfield, similar to DJ Moore last year, who Teddy Bridgewater was able to support. And what's weird is that his air yards in games have come in bunches. And here are his air yards by week. He had 51 in week 1, 258 in week 2, down to 26 in week 3, and back up to 158 in week 4. So just very little consistency there. Unfortunately, hasn't been able to turn that into a ton of production. He's only got one game above 8 PPR points, but maybe Drew Lock is the catalyst that gets him going this week against the Pittsburgh Steelers. But behind him, Tim Patrick has been the most valuable Broncos wide receiver, and he's actually been more productive than Sutton this year from a fantasy points perspective, even when Jerry Jeudy and KJ Hamler were in the lineup, Patrick is averaging just over 12 PPR points per game. Sutton's at around 10. His routes per dropback rate has increased steadily throughout the season too. He has jumped from 66% in week 1 to right around 80% in weeks 2 and 3, and topping out at 91% in week 4, which is his highest of the season. And he was the only Broncos player this past week with a route rate above 90% in week 4 besides Courtland Sutton. So the target share for the Broncos isn't particularly concentrated, and it's obviously been a little wonky with Judy getting hurt, with Hamler getting hurt. So we'll see how that changes, but they're throwing it about as much as we'd expect. Their pass rate over expectation is like right at 0%. So there may be some flex potential with Patrick in the right game script, game matchup, but not banking on him as anything more than that, and wouldn't add anyone else in this passing game besides Patrick, Sutton, and then Noah Fant, obviously the tight end. So I'm going to stack my stat chasing here today as I switch over the chart and talk about the Jets wide receivers to go along with the Zach Wilson talk earlier. So today it's stack chasing. God, I hate my dad jokes. Proceed with caution on this group, though, because Elijah Moore was out. This was Jamison Crowder's first game back, so we'll have to see how those two coexist. But I want to discuss this group nonetheless, because I think their running backs are almost useless at this point, and this might be the only source of fantasy value. But Corey Davis had another solid game. He pretty clearly seems like the Jets' X wide receiver, while Crowder returned to his normal slot role. Davis had 7 targets this week compared to 9 for Crowder, but Corey Davis's ADOT in this game was almost at 20 yards compared to just 6 yards for Crowder, which is not surprising. It's about what you would expect, but just want to point that out. They each ran a route on a similar number of dropbacks, with Corey Davis slightly edging out Crowder 83% to 78%. Keelan Cole was actually the wide receiver 3 this week. He ran a route on 69% of dropbacks, and it's most likely that he is the one that's phased out when Moore returns. Elijah Moore returns, because his routes rate rose significantly this past week. But anyway, back to Davis and Crowder. On the season, Davis is averaging a really solid 13.3 receiving expected points per week. That's higher than the aforementioned Tyler Lockett, but Crowder came in and got 20.1 receiving expected points in his first game back, and actually had -1 fantasy points over expectation in the game, while Davis had 7.5 fantasy points over expectation in the game. So these two are the 1A and 1B right now. They should have some usable weeks. I would still probably hold Elijah Moore to see what his role is like when he gets back and Crowder is still involved, because in the first 3 weeks, he had a weighted targets per out run of 0.58, which was dead even with Corey Davis in that stretch. And he'd only averaged 1 fewer target per game. He just couldn't convert on his opportunities. He had a very, very low 0.28 racer. And especially if Wilson continues to improve, the Jets actually rank pretty highly in combined target share of their top 3 guys, who are the 3 guys that I've talked about a bunch today. So each of these guys could have a solid 4, but it just may be that only one of them has a high ceiling each week. Wrapping up the wide receiver group is the Washington football team wide receivers. And again, this was Curtis Samuel's first game back, and the game was a lightning in a bottle because Taylor Heineke is just Ryan Fitzpatrick light. But before I get to Samuel's usage, just want to spend a second talking about Terry McLaurin, who's having a hell of a season so far. He's a wide receiver 1. He's run around on almost every single drop back for Washington. He has an elite or near elite mark in every category that's worth tracking for wide receivers. He has a 46% air yard share, a 31% target share, a 0.383 racer, a 0.69 whopper, and 0.69 weighted targets per out run. He's averaging almost 18 receiving expected points per game, has 2.46 yards per route run, and an 11.2 yard ADOT. So this guy is absolutely quarterback proof, which is, in my opinion, one of the best compliments that you can give to a wide receiver, especially in fantasy football. I don't think right now has the ceiling that Hopkins had when he was with the Texans, but it's a similar archetype because, again, he's had so much quarterback turnover and continues to produce like a wide receiver 1. But let's shift back to the other receivers. I'm actually going to talk about rookie wide receivers specifically at the end of the show, but things don't look great for Dyami Brown with Curtis Samuel, who ran a route on just 34% of dropbacks. Dyami's routes run percentage dropped to a season low 45% after being at 70% plus for the first 3 games and being at 90% plus for the first 2 games. Oddly enough, Adam Humphries' routes run rate has been above 70% in each of the last 3 games, but no receiver on this team outside of Terry McLaurin is averaging more than 4 targets per game. I suppose the benefit that Dyami has is that he's the team's deep threat, as I put in air quotes. His 14.2 yard ADOT leads the team, while Curtis Samuel had an ADOT of -1 yards this past week. But the long ADOT doesn't really add much to Dyami's reliability. Curtis Samuel is certainly worth an add if he is available, because I think his workload is and will be sustainable. It'll likely grow more as the team has more confidence in him. Might even take away from J.D. McKissick because they talked Samuel up all offseason. But I think, hopefully Pat's not listening to this, but I think Dyami can be dropped at this point. Couple other quick hitters before I get to tight ends. From Ben Gretsch, Mecole Hardman had his second straight week with a routes per dropback rate below 65% after being above 75% in each of the first 2 games. I'm not sure I want to drop him quite yet, but Josh Gordon signing doesn't help one bit. He got activated to the active roster. Michael Pittman showed up on every buy low model this past week. He almost hit. He got tackled at the 1 yard line, and then the Colts' terrible red zone offense couldn't convert. But he's led the team in targets each of the last 3 weeks and is averaging 9 targets per game on the season. He's got a really solid 42% air yards share and a 0.66 whopper. I see him in the same vein as like Jacoby Myers, as sort of a low end wide receiver 3, high end wide receiver 4 with some upside, but not really enough to trust in the offense to be a consistent starter outside of being a flex play. Stefon Diggs still remains a buy low. He leads the league in air yards per game. He's the only player to record 100 plus air yards in every single game so far this season. His time is coming soon. And then this from Trico out in the Discord, a question he had: are there teams with very concentrated target shares that nobody is talking about? The Jets, like I mentioned before, I think stand out. The Steelers for sure. I don't think they're that big of a secret, but similar to the Bengals, it's the top 3 wide receivers and Najee Harris, who are really the only ones getting targeted. They're passing it a shit ton because they just suck so much. I also mentioned a couple of weeks ago that the Browns' target share was not that condensed, but Odell Beckham Jr. has a very strong 27% target share in the past 2 weeks that he's played. He's got a 47% air yard share in those 2 games, and he right now is the only Browns player outside of the 2 running backs that I would entertain starting this week, and that may change when Landry returns. Okay, going to try to go through the tight end section a little quick. Every week I put these notes together and I think, man, I need more. And then I get here and I talk way longer than I expect. But first tight end is Bengals tight end, CJ Uzomah, who had a really good Thursday night against the Jaguars. But as far as I'm concerned, his usage is more noise than signal. Last year, he had a breakout game on Thursday Night Football with a touchdown and then got put on IR for the rest of the season. So hopefully that doesn't happen to him. But Joe Burrow did say after the game that on the screen pass to Uzomah that essentially locked up the win for the Bengals. He said that it's not the usual personnel that they have on a play like that, with Uzomah being spread out wide. And what he means by that is that T. Higgins, who is expected back in week 5, would be in that set out wide instead of Uzomah. But if you want some positives, he's played on 70% of snaps or more in every single game. He has a routes run rate of 76%, and he's the only Bengals tight end to actually record a target so far this season. But like I said, that passing game is so concentrated around the 3 receivers. The 3 of them have a combined target share of nearly 80%, which is by far the highest in the league. And the offense does not want to pass as much as they can. Again, when Higgins returns, he'll likely be left by the wayside. And yeah, I wouldn't add him. I wouldn't go running to add him from the waiver wire unless it's maybe a tight end premium league. But Dawson Knox is someone that I would add. It's time to start paying attention to him because he's currently tight end 6 on the year with an average of just over 13 points per game in PPR, thanks to 2 straight games with 15 plus PPR points. On the season, he's got a 13% target share with an average of 5 targets per game, which isn't terrible for a tight end by any means. He's running a route on a solid 68% of dropbacks, but he's only averaging 36 receiving yards per game. He has 4 touchdowns on the season, which is tied with Rob Gronkowski for the most among tight ends. I think if you can sell high on him, you absolutely should, because like I said, Stefon Diggs' time is going to come soon. There aren't many tight ends outside of the top 4 to 5 guys that can sustain his usage, and he's averaging nearly 4 fantasy points over expectation per game this season. Tyler Higbee is the last tight end I'll talk about. So far this season, he's had 2 solid games with 10 plus PPR points and 2 dud games with fewer than 8 PPR points, which leaves him as the tight end 14 on the season. He's actually tied for 3rd on the team in targets with 18, which amounts to a 13% target share, which again is not bad for a tight end. And Los Angeles's pass rate over expectation has climbed each week over the past 4 weeks since the beginning of the year. He's running around on 78% of dropbacks, which is also solid for a tight end. And his 0.16 targets per route run is okay, but nothing to write home about. I think right now he's a low end tight end 1 with how efficient that offense is operating, and Kupp being the clear primary passing threat in the offense. The one last nugget I'll add is that with Gerald Everett's absence, Will Disley ran a route on 61% of dropbacks. He only saw 2 targets. It seems like it's just another year where the Seahawks tight ends are useless, and Metcalf and Lockett, like I said before, the only guys really worth holding on to in that passing attack. All right, going to get adjusted here for the team-by-team section. Talking first about the Jacksonville Jaguars, and there's a chance that they have a new coach by this time next week, but that's neither here nor there. Trevor Lawrence, I talked about him a bit last week, and I don't want to rehash. Excuse me. I don't want to rehash it all because he had been bad through the first 3 weeks, but Thursday night was probably the best game of the year so far for him. He's starting to use his legs more, which is good. He has at least 6 carries and 25 yards in each of the last 2 weeks. He also had a CPOE of 11% in this game, which is his highest mark in a single game this season by far. He has 200 plus passing yards in 3 of 4 games, and it was the first game of the season for him without a turnover, but he didn't have a passing touchdown and only has 2 in the last 3 weeks. So still, I think, a bench guy, but a little bit more attention should be paid to him. He's really good. He's really good at quarterback. The running backs, Carlos Hyde, as Ben Gretsch would put it, was inactive for this game because he was old and sore. He was actually out with a shoulder injury. That made James Robinson the man of the hour. Daria Gumbawale stepped up in Hyde's absence, but played a very limited role. But it was Robinson's second straight game with 20-plus opportunities. He's averaging over 16 opportunities per game. And for reference, he averaged over 21 per game last year. He also played a season-high 95% of the snaps. And I want to talk about this backfield a little bit in the context of the first 3 weeks, because I don't expect Hyde to be out that much longer, if at all. Robinson's been pretty solid, playing on 65% of snaps with a routes per dropback rate of 56%. He has over 4 high-value touches per game and a receiving expected points value of just above 7 points per game. All of those are worthy of being a high-end running back 2 that could turn him into a running back 1 again, if not for Hyde. But Hyde's currently averaging just under 8 opportunities per game. He's got a 31% snap share, and fortunately, he's only taking away 1 high-value touch per game away from Robinson. But if he were to get hurt, again, God forbid, I do think Urban Meyer, if he is still around, would not hesitate to treat Carlos Hyde like a bell cow. But ultimately, it would be great if Hyde was a non-factor so that Robinson could dominate like he did on Thursday, but that's unlikely to be the case. The worst news of the night on Thursday night is that DJ Chark left the game after a couple snaps with an ankle injury. It sounds like he'll be out for the season. They put him on IR. There hasn't been any definitive answer if he's going to be out for the season, but who does that leave us with? Well, we've got the God, Laviska Shenault, and Marvin Jones. There's really nobody else that I want to touch in this passing attack. So just going to focus on those 2 guys. Before this past week, Marvin Jones looked like the wide receiver 1 in the offense, but that flipped a little bit. After back-to-back games of 100-plus air yards, Marvin Jones has had 80 total air yards in the last 2 games combined, while Viska has had 90. He had 95 air yards in week 4, including that lovely deep pass from Trevor Lawrence while he was on the run. And that gave him a 0.81 Whopper, which was the 9th highest Whopper on the week, as Ben pointed out in his newsletter. But Jones on the season still has a very elite 96% routes run rate compared to just 82% for Laviska. I'd expect that to jump a bit for Shenault without Chark, but on the season, things are pretty close to even for those 2. There's Shenault has a 20% target share. Jones has a 23% target share. Viska has a 0.5 weighted targets per route run. It's 0.56 for Jones. Shenault has 11.5 expected points per game to 13.5 expected points per game for Jones. So I doubt you have both of these guys, but they're probably both flex plays for the rest of the season, with each of them having weekly upside. And we can only hope that this turns into a very concentrated offense between the two and the rest of the guys that aren't really a factor. To wrap up the show, have a pair of NFC East teams, and wanted to bring up the Cowboys for one, I think, really big reason, and one point that I want to make. And I'll talk about the guys in more depth, but Dallas's pass rate over expectation has been below 0 and significantly below 0 in every game except for the first game against the Bucs, when we knew that they were passing the ball a ton because it was part of their game plan against a stout Bucs defense. So Dak is still going to be efficient as hell and is really just a better version of Joe Burrow, whose team also has a terribly low pass rate over expectation. But after throwing it 58 times in week 1, Dak has thrown it 27, 26, and 22 times. So if you remember, he was on the top right part of the quarterback chart for the season. So, you know, he's going to be efficient. His receivers are going to be efficient, but this defense looks quite improved, or at least better than expected. So if they keep him in games, then I don't think McCarthy is going to have any reason to pass the ball more than they should. But this, in turn, would benefit the running backs. And I know everyone and their mother wants it to be Tony Pollard RB1 season, but it's not, and it won't be for a while, unfortunately. This is pretty much a 65-35 split in the backfield across almost every metric, which is wild. Zeke has a 76% snap share on the year, doesn't have a game below 70%, and Tony Pollard's at 31% without a game over 40% on the year. Pollard does have, I guess, some better news, because he's got 38% of running back touches compared to just 60% for Zeke. And I guess, again, the other bonus for Pollard is that when he is running routes, they really want to get him the ball because he has a targets per route run of 0.29. And despite routes run rate of 19%, he has 53% of running back receptions so far this season. But Zeke is an RB1 right now. He actually looks like he's running pretty well. Pollard's a fine flex play, I think, and is probably better served in some of the shootout matchups and ones that the Cowboys might be passing a lot. And as far as the pass catchers, going to talk about them in the context of the last 3 weeks since Michael Gallup has been out, because that's, again, also the 3 weeks that their pass rate has plummeted. CeeDee Lamb's route rate, coincidentally, has jumped up to 98% over the past 3 weeks after being at just 76% in week 1. That's obviously, a lot of that's due to the Gallup injury, but it's still encouraging. Between Lamb, Amari Cooper, and Dalton Schultz actually leads the team in weighted targets per route run, which, again, is hilarious. It helps that he's tied for target share over the last 3 weeks. He's averaging more receiving expected points per game than Amari Cooper and about the same as Lamb, but has a fantasy points over expectation per game of 6.2 points per game. He's probably in a sell high situation right now, similar to Dawson Knox, but I don't think that it's sustainable, especially when Gallup returns. Cooper's route rate has held steady at around 94% all season. He gave managers a bit of a scare this past week with the hamstring injury earlier in the game, but toughed it out and scored nearly 16 PPR points after 2 straight games below 6 PPR points. I'm not worried about Lamb and Cooper, and I actually think this is a solid buy low opportunity for Lamb because his fantasy production has dipped a little bit, and that window may close as soon as this week. talked a lot about the NFC East today. Yeah, touched on all of them. You'd think this would be in prime time based on how much I'm talking about them. But Philadelphia Eagles, wrapping up the show. Jalen Hurts has been a great fantasy quarterback this season. Not really much to say about him other than stardom. But in case you're wondering, here are some reasons to believe in his continued success. The Eagles currently rate second in pass rate over expectation, which is great. Hurts has a 3.3% CPOE, 8.45 adjusted yards per attempt, and a 1.09 pacer. So getting a little help from his receiver group. He's also currently second in quarterback rushing yards behind only Lamar Jackson, which has helped him average over 24 points per game. So keep starting him. He's a stud. He's doing really well. Moving on to the running backs, Tony Pollard RB1 season is overrated because it's Kenny Gainwell RB1 season, baby. Gainwell is averaging 4.5 targets per game so far this year and has as many green zone touches as Miles Sanders. He's still only seeing between 30 and 40% of snaps this week, but he's involved. He's clearly capping the ceiling of Sanders, who doesn't have a snap share above 70% in a single game yet. So Gainwell certainly seems like he is more of a threat to Sanders' role than Pollard does to Zeke. And Gainwell is actually averaging just over 6 receiving expected points per game, which is the highest of any of the 4 NFC running backs I've talked about. It's actually second among NFC East running backs behind only Saquon. So that's saying something. On the flip side, it looks like he's only in that Darren Sproles role because his rush EP is just under 3 expected points per game, the lowest of that bunch. So he can be, I think, a pretty confident flex play too, while Sanders is just a running back 2 at the moment. In terms of their pass catchers, Devontae Smith is still the cream of the crop with a 0.62 Whopper, a weighted targets per out run of 0.54. Both of those are leading the team thanks to his 44% air yard share and 22% target share. Rager's just sort of meh at this point. He's running a route on 77% of dropbacks. He has a 14% target share and 18% air yards share, but he's averaging about as many receiving expected points per game at 8 as Dallas Goedert. He's also at 0.8 yards per route run, which is the lowest between him, Smith, Goddard, and Zach Ertz. And I don't really want to start Rager despite the high pass rate. You can hold on to him for now, but that's probably about it. But moving on to the tight end, Zach Ertz is just being Zach Ertz again, his old consistent self. His 14% target share is tied with Rager. He scored at least 12 PPR points in each of his last 2 games. He has an average of 10 receiving EP per game with an FPO of negative 1.5. In fact, over those last 2 games, Ertz is second on the team in targets with only 1 fewer target than Devonta Smith. Goddard, on the flip side, has yet to see more than 5 targets in a single game and is averaging nearly 3 FPO per game on top of his 8 receiving expected points per game. Both the tight ends are running a route on around 60% of dropbacks, but they'll continue to cannibalize each other's opportunities and ruin their ceilings. But with as disgusting as the tight end landscape is, I would still probably start, both of them on a weekly basis. Before I get out of here, I've got one more thing I want to talk about. This offseason, I wrote an article on 4for4, and I'm going to share it again tomorrow, but it was looking at rookie wide receivers, evaluating them based on certain thresholds for yards, air yard share, Whopper, all these different types of stats, and trying to see what benchmarks rookie wide receivers had to meet in order to have an above average win rate in best ball leagues. So obviously a lot of you, best ball leagues are not managed, but wanted to talk through this just a little bit. And what the model that I built found was that within the first 4 weeks of the season, if a rookie wide receiver has at least 36 yards per game and either a 21.5% air yard share or a 0.69 racer, that he was pretty likely to have an above average win rate. So again, a lot of these guys that are on this list that make the cut are guys you're going to have on teams, but something to be confident in them about. So the 4 guys that meet those thresholds are Jalen Waddle. He's averaging 50 yards per game, has a 14% air yard share and a 1.4 racer. Rondale Moore is averaging 53 yards per game, a 4% air yard share, but a 5.28 racer. Devontae Smith is averaging 59 yards per game, 43% air yard share, and 0.53 racer. And finally, Jamar Chase, who has an average of 74 yards per game, a 44% air yard share, and a 0.83 racer. So he meets all 3 of the criteria. So those guys, again, I don't think you're dropping them anytime soon, but it is some reason for optimism for those rookie wide receivers. A couple notable guys that obviously didn't make the cut. Diami Brown, who again, I think can be cut in your leagues. Terrace Marshall, Elijah Moore, and then Rashad Bateman will have to see on him. Hopefully he makes his return in week 5. Of these guys, I'm probably most encouraged by Terrace Marshall and Elijah Moore. But again, you can drop Diami if you need some bench space. And again, with the way Lamar Jackson's been throwing the ball, Rashad Bateman could be in for a good second half of the season, or last 3/4 of the season. But that's going to do it for the show today. Please remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel, become a Ship Chasing member so you can join the Discord, chat with me, Pete, Pat, all the other guys as well. And good luck in week 5.